Listen, close your eyes to the polite rooms and imagine this: a chandelier spilling light over linen napkins, a piano playing in the next room, and beneath the polished floorboards a network of doors and devices designed to erase a man's soul. This is not speculation. Federal ledger entries, private letters, and the whispered testimony of freed men point to a clandestine architecture of cruelty, led not by men in black coats, but by women in silk and lace. They perfected a science of breaking, a clinical cruelty so refined it read like a laboratory protocol rather than a crime. They called their gatherings salons, supper parties, charity drives. Behind those polite invitations, they traded techniques, refined rituals, and compared notes on the easiest ways to extract obedience from the human heart. Names you recognize in society columns appear in these accounts, faces you would trust haunt these pages. These women were educated, well-read, and convinced, dangerously convinced, that their intellect gave them the right to experiment on other people. Their tools were not only whips and stocks, they were timing, isolation, calculation. They weaponized intimacy, the family, the promise of bread, the hint of mercy, all wielded like scalpels. Hear me, this is the history your textbooks whisper past. The pattern repeats: a man disappears from the field at dusk, returns weeks later hollowed out, a wife is moved, a child sold, and the man's very memory is rewired to dutiful silence. The methods were surgical in their cruelty: long, slow sessions of humiliation, engineered betrayals, orchestrated scarcity, and in too many cases, sexual violence and invasive control masked as correction. I will not linger on obscene detail. What matters is the method. These were systematic assaults on identity, designed to remake a person into a compliant shadow. There are journals, hand-scrawled entries hidden in cabins, receipts for clandestine shipments, and a ledger that marks the movement of men between estates like inventory. There are carpenters' notes about padded rooms and drainage, overseers' memos about temporary transfers, and there are testimonies from those who survived, whose voices tremble when they recall the names of the mistresses who orchestrated this commerce in human ruin. If you want to anchor this moment and seal what you learn, type "The veil is broken" twice in the comments to make this truth yours. And before you keep listening, subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Your location becomes a thread in this story's map. We will follow one investigation across river landings and hidden ledgers to a night when a federal inspector discovered rooms meant to erase memory and a ledger that names the women who trafficked bodies between estates. The Mississippi Corridor in the 1840s was a kingdom of cotton and deception. To the eye of a passing traveler, the plantations gleamed like marble palaces rising from a sea of white fields. Grand porches stretched across manicured lawns, Greek columns cast long shadows at dusk, and the soft glow of lanterns reflected on the river like a promise of civilization. But beauty here was camouflage. Behind each elegant facade, beneath every coat of imported paint, there existed a subterranean order. Hidden chambers, coded correspondences, and rituals no guest would ever witness. The women who ran these estates had been raised in finishing schools, trained in the languages of refinement. They studied French poetry, German philosophy, and the latest European sciences of the body and mind. But in their hands, this education warped into something else. They viewed the men in their possession not as workers, not even as human beings, but as material, subjects for their experiments. It was not the raw violence of overseers that concerned them, but the subtler thrill of total domination. They wanted to prove that they could rewire will itself. The records show that deaths came in clusters. 6 men gone in a single week at Riverside Estate, 4 more vanished from Elmwood, 2 bodies pulled from the river at Cedar Hill. Each time the explanations were the same: fever accident, attempted flight. But the timing gave them away. When a steamboat arrived, bearing crates marked as wine or medical supplies, the accidents began. When the boat departed, silence returned, until the next cycle. What made these women dangerous was not only their wealth, but their unity. Their marriages tied them to some of the South's most powerful dynasties. Their letters tied them to each other, and their isolation, husbands absent on trade, politics, or banking, gave them the freedom to conduct their gatherings undisturbed. They were left with entire estates in their command, entire populations under their experiment, An inspector named Hartwell, dispatched from Washington, stumbled onto their pattern. At first, it was only numbers on a page, mortality reports, receipts, inconsistent ledgers. But when he set foot inside the quarters, when he saw iron bars on windows meant for sleeping huts, when he ran his hand across walls padded to swallow sound, the arithmetic became undeniable. Something was being engineered here with precision. Something darker than the field, darker than the whip. And what he found next was worse. The enslaved themselves, moving like shadows, avoiding eye contact, their very essence hollowed. They were not simply beaten, they were unmade. Hartwell's notes, smuggled north in fragments, describe his first night on the grounds of Magnolia Hall. The estate itself stood like a fortress of deception, rose gardens curling around statues imported from Italy, fountains murmuring with an elegance meant to impress visiting merchants. But when the evening fell and the last glass of Madeira was raised in the parlor, he followed the servants' lanterns out back. That was when the illusion collapsed. Behind the gardens, hidden by a row of weeping willows, lay a cluster of outbuildings that bore no resemblance to barns or kitchens. They were windowless, square, and low to the ground. The air carried a strange metallic tang, as if the soil itself had been soaked in iron. Hartwell described doors bolted from the outside, and, when the hinges creaked open, the silence within was more terrible than screams. Inside, the people sat perfectly still. Not chained, not crying, not even whispering, just waiting. Their faces were blank, eyes glazed, bodies unnaturally composed. Hartwell later wrote that the stillness unnerved him more than any violence he had witnessed in the field, because it was deliberate. These were not captives merely crushed by exhaustion. They had been conditioned into obedience, stripped of even the reflex to resist. He uncovered the tools soon after. Medical journals in French, tinctures labeled in Latin, devices imported from Paris that combined restraint with stimulation. The women had purchased these instruments not for healing, but for control. They mixed sedatives with hallucinogens, tested regimes of sleep deprivation, and used sound, repetitive hymns, foreign chants, tones struck on imported tuning forks, to destabilize the mind. Then, with careful reward and punishment, they rebuilt it in the mold they desired. The local doctor, a man named Keating, signed death certificates with calm indifference. He labeled the fallen as victims of consumption or marsh fever, but Hartwell knew better. He found records of dosing schedules, journals kept in an elegant feminine hand describing progress achieved, and subjects unfit for continuation. To them, every human life was a ledger entry, a variable in a private study. Perhaps the most chilling discovery was the gatherings themselves. Every fortnight, the women assembled under candlelight in Magnolia's library, the curtains drawn tight, the portraits of ancestors watching from the walls. They compared notes like scholars, discussing which herbs rendered men docile, which tones broke them fastest, which punishments erased memory most cleanly. It was not drunken cruelty, nor sudden violence. It was ritualized, rehearsed, and intellectual. Hartwell wrote one line that would not leave his mind. These are not women preserving slavery. They are perfecting it. Hartwell's warning nearly vanished into silence, for who in Washington wished to confront such horrors when cotton profits flowed like rivers of gold? Yet his letters, smuggled north through abolitionist channels, were preserved. They reveal not only the cruelty of these women, but the orderliness of their designs. Their gatherings were never random evenings of sadism. They were structured like academies, each plantation serving as a classroom, each experiment another lesson to be shared. At Rosewood Plantation, for example, the mistress was praised for her method of induced amnesia. She discovered that isolating a man in total darkness, paired with repeated doses of laudanum, could erase weeks of memory. At Elmwood, another woman perfected her reward cycles, offering brief moments of freedom or comfort, only to strip them away, training her captives to anticipate loss more than pain. At Cedar Hill, journals recorded the use of sound low frequencies played on modified instruments, creating vibrations that disoriented the mind until submission became reflex. This was not folklore. Hartwell transcribed passages from their own correspondence, letters exchanged in delicate cursive, sealed with wax bearing the insignias of their families. One such letter read, "Dearest L, your last note on the subject of compliance was most illuminating. I shall attempt your regimen with the 3 who remain." The tone was almost casual, like sisters writing about sewing patterns or garden seeds. Yet the content was unmistakable. They were trading formulas of human domination. The enslaved who survived bore the marks of these gatherings long after. Some could no longer speak, their voices reduced to murmurs or silence. Others flinched at every sound, as though expecting punishment. A few seemed emptied entirely, moving through fields like ghosts, eyes fixed on some horizon no one else could see. The community whispered of them as all-owed ones, living reminders that the women's science left no scar on the flesh, but carved into the soul. Hartwell's greatest fear was not only what these women had already done, but what they might achieve if left unchecked. For here was a system more insidious than chains or whips, a system that sought to erase resistance itself, to sculpt obedience so deeply that it would pass on to the next generation. He understood that these gatherings were not merely sustaining slavery. They were envisioning its future, a future where the enslaved would not need overseers at all, for their minds would already belong to their masters. And so he wrote in one trembling line, "If this knowledge spreads, slavery will no longer require force. It will breed itself into permanence." The deeper Hartwell pried, the more he realized the women's power extended far beyond their own estates. They were not isolated matrons acting in secrecy, they were a network. The Mississippi River was their artery, and through it flowed not just cotton and sugar, but knowledge, instruments, and correspondence. Steamboat captains carried crates labeled as perfumes or botanical extracts that in truth contained narcotics, imported devices, and European texts on mesmerism, phrenology, and anatomy. The gatherings rotated from plantation to plantation, always under the cover of respectability. When one estate hosted a charity ball, another arranged a musical evening. In reality, these were coded signals, each event masking a private conclave where discoveries were exchanged. The husbands and male relatives, distracted by politics, trade, or war preparations, rarely interfered. And when they did, the women cloaked their activities in the language of refinement. Scientific curiosity, ladies' health societies, domestic education. Hartwell's notes describe how this network mirrored the structure of a clandestine order. Initiation required not only wealth, but proof of discretion and cruelty. A new member was tested by being given 3 subjects and asked to document the results of her conditioning. If her notes were deemed precise, if her methods produced obedience without death, she was admitted into the circle. Those who failed disappeared quietly, their plantations ruined by scandal, their names erased from polite society. The enslaved who endured these tests carried the burden for generations. Oral histories passed through hushed voices spoke of the woman who stole dreams. Survivors told their children never to sing certain hymns, never to trust sweet drinks offered in the night, never to fall asleep in silence. For they knew the songs, the tonics, the darkness, all were tools that could unmake a mind. These warnings, though fragile, became threads of resistance, a way to preserve dignity when every other defense had been stripped away. Hartwell's growing terror was that the South itself might bend around this hidden science. If these methods spread beyond a circle of elite women, if overseers, merchants, or even armies adopted them, the entire institution of slavery could transform into something far more enduring. An empire not of chains, but of conditioned obedience. His final lines in that chapter tremble with urgency. "I fear what is being born here is not merely cruelty, it is a system of control that may outlive its creators." The question that haunted him most was simple, and it would haunt history as well. How many minds had already been broken so completely that they could never be restored? By the time Hartwell reached Riverside Estate, he understood that what he was confronting was not isolated sadism. It was architecture. Every detail of the plantation had been meticulously engineered to facilitate control. Fences weren't just barriers, they were signals. Gates were timed to open and close according to shifts in the sun and moon, dictating movement with precision. Quarters were arranged not for comfort or convenience, but to maximize psychological leverage. Sightlines, sound corridors, even airflow was manipulated to unnerve and disorient. Inside the main house, the opulence was a mask for horror. Chandeliers sparkled over polished floors, yet in the hidden recesses, rooms awaited their human subjects. Here, men were stripped of identity and subjected to experiments designed to map obedience. Some were forced to witness their families suffer. Wives flogged, children confined, while instruments of restraint and sedatives tested their mental endurance. Others were isolated, denied speech, light, or warmth, until the boundaries of their own perception began to dissolve. Hartwell recorded that these were not acts of spontaneous cruelty, but orchestrated, scheduled, and recorded meticulously in journals by the women themselves. The enslaved men's transformation was horrifying to witness. Once proud and strong, they returned from these sessions hollowed, their spirits severed from any semblance of resistance. Some spoke in whispers, careful never to meet a mistress's gaze. Others moved in jerks and pauses, as though rehearsed by invisible hands. One man, according to Hartwell, had forgotten how to laugh, how to argue, how to assert even a simple preference. All that remained was a quiet obedience born from terror, not choice. Hartwell also discovered the instruments used in these psychological experiments. Beds with hidden restraints, tables with slots for hands and feet, and padded rooms where sound could be controlled completely. These rooms were designed to erase selfhood, to teach that defiance led only to suffering. Notes from the women detailed timing, dosage, and responses, an early cruel form of behavioral science applied to human beings. The level of calculation, the precision, suggested a systematic methodology, not impulse. Even more disturbing were the letters exchanged between the women. One from Victoria Pembroke to Lucinda Belmont stated plainly, "The minds yield faster when the body is spared unnecessary pain. It is the anticipation of loss that teaches obedience most efficiently." Another remarked on how love, loyalty, and family ties could be twisted into instruments of control. They had discovered that breaking the heart could shatter the mind far more effectively than brute force. If you wish to anchor this revelation into your own consciousness, type, "The veil is broken," twice in the comments. These words are a small ritual, a way to confront a truth buried for centuries. The enslaved were not merely worked or beaten, they were studied, mapped, and unmade. And it is here, at Riverside Estate, that Hartwell realized the full scale of the conspiracy, a network of women transforming human lives into experiments, one mind at a time. Hartwell's investigation revealed another layer of cruelty that went beyond punishment or control. It was ownership of the very essence of a person. These women did not merely want compliance, they wanted total reconstruction. They measured obedience not by simple tasks or labor, but by how completely a man could be severed from his own desires and rewired to anticipate their will. In journals smuggled from Cedar Hill, he read detailed accounts of sessions where men were forced to recite loyalty oaths, while their families were subjected to pain just out of sight. Each correct response was rewarded with small reprieves, each hesitation intensified suffering. What made this network particularly insidious was its psychological sophistication. They understood that the mind could be coerced as easily as the body. They tested which threats induced fear, which forms of isolation prompted submission, and which rituals of humiliation left lasting scars without leaving a mark on the skin. One woman wrote in her private ledger about a loyalty assessment, noting the exact moment a man's spirit snapped, when he no longer resisted because the emotional cost of defiance became unbearable. The ripple effects of these methods extended across plantations. Men who survived these sessions returned to labor under the eyes of the women who orchestrated them, carrying the memory of broken friends and tortured relatives. Families were weaponized, their bonds exploited to maintain absolute control. Hartwell recorded testimony from free men like Samuel Fletcher, who had built specialized rooms and devices for the women. "They told me it was for discipline," Fletcher whispered, eyes darting around the inn. "But I've seen the young ones come back different shadows of themselves, hollow where fire once burned." The heart is broken first, then the mind follows. The correspondence between the women also revealed a disturbing camaraderie. They shared strategies, compared results, and offered advice on how to push a man's obedience to the limit. One letter, smuggled from Melrose, described a ritual involving threats against a wife while the husband was chained and blindfolded, carefully timed so that despair would crescendo into submission. They recorded every reaction, every falter, every tiny sign of resistance. To them, these were not people. They were variables in an experiment designed to perfect human domination. Hartwell understood that the danger was systemic. This was not isolated brutality. It was the creation of a methodology, a dark science of obedience that could spread, replicated across estates, passed down to the next generation of women. And as he wrote in his report, they are no longer mistresses. They are architects of the mind itself, reshaping what it means to be human. And once more, if this truth resonates, type, "The veil is broken," twice in the comments. This is the moment to acknowledge what they tried to bury: a hidden network, a calculated cruelty, a science of domination that touched the heart, mind, and soul of every victim. By the time Hartwell reached Oakwood Manor, the scale of the conspiracy was undeniable. The women had perfected a system of terror that left no evidence for casual observers. To neighbors and visiting merchants, life at Oakwood appeared serene: manicured lawns, horse-drawn carriages, and laughter echoing from the drawing rooms. But in the hidden wings of the estate, men moved silently under the weight of their own broken minds, the invisible scars of obedience etched deep within them. Hartwell recorded one encounter that chilled him to his core. In a small courtyard, a man named Thomas had been confined in a room for nearly 3 weeks. When brought outside, his body moved fluidly, but his eyes revealed a vacant awareness. No resistance, no emotion, only the reflexive motions the women had trained into him. When Hartwell asked him to recall events from confinement, Thomas could not, or would not, form the words. It was as if the hours had been erased, replaced with an artificial compliance that belonged entirely to another's will. What struck Hartwell most was how the women exploited love and attachment as instruments of destruction. Wives, children, even close friends were leveraged against the men, each act carefully calculated. One journal detailed a session where a husband was forced to watch his wife and child subjected to a sequence of pain, reward, and deprivation, timed precisely to shatter his resistance. By the end, the man's love was twisted into fear, and his loyalty shifted from family to mistress. These were not flukes. They were systematic tests, repeated and refined across the 7 plantations. The women themselves treated these gatherings with the solemnity of scholars conducting experiments. Each meeting was documented, with notes exchanged in the elegance of cursive and the language of science. They compared methods, discussed failures, and celebrated breakthroughs. One particularly chilling line from a letter read, "The more the heart resists, the more exquisite the compliance once it yields." They had discovered that the most human qualities, love, loyalty, hope, could be weaponized more effectively than chains or whips. Hartwell realized that this was more than cruelty, it was a science of the human soul. Each procedure, each observation, each secret gathering served to codify methods of domination, creating a legacy that could outlast them all. The river, the plantations, and the hidden rooms became laboratories for an unholy knowledge, one that measured and manipulated the very essence of obedience. To truly confront this, viewers must acknowledge the hidden architecture of cruelty. Type, "The veil is broken," twice in the comments to mark this revelation. Let it serve as a ritual, a conscious recognition that history hides more than it reveals, and that even the most refined elegance can cloak the deepest depravity. The truth is now before you, silent, unyielding, and impossible to ignore. As Hartwell continued, he began to piece together the origins of the network that had so systematically enslaved not only bodies but minds. The roots stretched back nearly a decade, to when these women first began corresponding in the hush of finishing schools, their letters filled with observations that masqueraded as intellectual curiosity. They were fascinated by European theories on human behavior, mesmerism, and the nascent science of psychology. Yet, what started as abstract discussion soon mutated into applied experimentation, first small, then grand, and finally monstrous in its scope. At Cedar Hill, he found letters detailing the earliest experiments. One instructive passage outlined the obedience timetable, a schedule dictating precisely when a man would receive reward or punishment, often multiple times per day. Notes described using light, darkness, and sound to create disorientation, forcing the mind to bend to expectation. Another journal described a loyalty calibration, where love and family ties were systematically tested, stretched, and broken, teaching the enslaved that hope carried cost, and defiance invited suffering. These were not acts of impulsive malice. They were procedural, recorded, analyzed, and perfected. Hartwell also discovered the network's disturbing scale. Through coded correspondence, the women shared not only methods, but subjects themselves. A man who had resisted at one plantation would be sent to another for further conditioning. They catalogued responses, tracked behavioral shifts, and, horrifyingly, traded individuals like currency in an invisible market of compliance. Free black workers, often forced to build or maintain the specialized chambers, spoke in whispers of men who returned not dead, but not living, souls erased, bodies present, obedience absolute. One account revealed the women's twisted intellectual pride. Victoria Pembroke wrote in a letter, "The mind submits far quicker than the body. Once the heart is hollowed, the flesh follows willingly." These were women who measured human essence like currency, whose experiments transformed natural instincts, love, loyalty, defiance, into instruments of control. And they did so under the guise of refinement, philanthropy, and high society, shielded by wealth, class, and silence. By this point, Hartwell understood the true horror. The enslaved men were being unmade, and the knowledge itself was infectious. If these techniques spread beyond the circle, they could redefine slavery, not as a system of labor, but as a system of psychological domination, perfected, replicable, and invisible to the casual observer. The stakes were higher than mortality. They had reached the very core of identity, intent, and selfhood. For those listening, feel the weight of this revelation. Type, "The veil is broken," twice in the comments, a small ritual to acknowledge what was hidden for so long. You are now part of the circle of awareness, witnesses to a cruelty so meticulously engineered that it defies comprehension, yet once revealed, cannot be unseen. Hartwell's investigation next took him to Magnolia Grove, a plantation that, on the surface, radiated genteel southern charm. But behind the grand columns and polished floors, the machinery of psychological domination was at its peak. He noted the subtle innovations that set this estate apart: corridors that amplified footsteps, ceilings that transmitted whispers, rooms so constructed that a man's presence could be monitored without intrusion. Every element of the physical space was designed to reinforce fear, anticipation, and submission. Inside, he found men whose transformation was both profound and terrifying. They moved fluidly but mechanically, speaking only when prompted, their eyes avoiding contact as if any glance might provoke punishment. One man, formerly robust and defiant, now flinched at the shadow of a door, recalling only fragmented memories of his past life. Hartwell compared these changes with Marcus Washington's journal and realized that the patterns were methodical. Pain, anticipation, reward, and deprivation combined into a behavioral formula honed over years. The women's journals at Magnolia Grove revealed chilling creativity. One entry described a ritualistic test of attachment, where a husband was forced to choose between the pain of a loved one and the illusion of safety for himself. Each decision was timed, noted, and analyzed. The women debated outcomes through letters, sharing insights on how to maximize compliance without leaving overt marks. The objective was clear: to sculpt obedience deep into the psyche, ensuring it endured long after the sessions ended. Hartwell also uncovered the psychological hierarchy the women maintained among the enslaved. Men who resisted or displayed stubbornness were given to the most experienced mistress in the circle, while those who yielded more quickly were used as models in future experiments. They measured reactions meticulously: pulse, breath, facial tension, and eventual acquiescence. No act of cruelty was random. Every moment was part of a deliberate attempt to decode human resilience and reshape it in the image of their control. Even the estate's free black workers were trapped in this system, coerced into complicity. Samuel Fletcher described how he and others were forced to maintain rooms and devices, aware of the horrors being inflicted but powerless to intervene. "We built the cages, Inspector," Fletcher whispered, "but the ghosts inside were never ours. They belonged to her, to them, to the system they perfected." Hartwell understood the insidiousness of it all. This was not mere punishment. It was a calculated architecture of domination, invisible to the untrained eye, but devastating in its effect. Type, "The veil is broken," twice in the comments to internalize this truth. Recognize the systematic nature of the cruelty. the way love, loyalty, and identity were weaponized. This is no longer history you observe. It is a consciousness you must confront, a hidden design of control that shaped lives, minds, and generations. Hartwell's next stop was Roseland Plantation, where the Belmonteses had refined psychological control into a dark art. The estate was a maze of corridors, hidden alcoves, and soundproof chambers, each designed to isolate, confuse, and manipulate. What struck Hartwell most was the precision with which every element worked together. Doors that creaked only when opened, rooms that echoed footsteps like a warning, and windows that allowed observation without detection. It was a theater of obedience, and the enslaved men were the unwilling actors. Inside, Hartwell encountered men whose spirits had been fractured to an almost unimaginable degree. Some could barely respond to questions, others repeated phrases dictated by the women, as if rehearsed for an invisible audience. One man, he noted in his journal, had developed an almost instinctive terror response, flinching at shadows, wincing at the slightest noise, eyes darting toward doors and corners. These reactions were no accident. They were the cumulative product of years of experimentation, each session recorded in meticulous detail by the women analyzed, and refined like a formula in a laboratory. Letters exchanged between the Belmonteses and the other mistresses revealed a disturbing philosophy. One letter instructed that the mind must be conquered before the body can yield without rebellion. Another emphasized the weaponization of attachment, noting that love is the lever that shifts obedience from superficial to absolute. Through these writings, Hartwell realized that the women were not merely punishing or controlling, they were methodically dismantling identity itself. Family bonds, emotional resilience, and the capacity to resist were all tested, measured, and broken. The scope of the conspiracy became even clearer when Hartwell traced the movement of men between plantations. Those deemed resistant were transferred to estates with the most skilled mistresses, subjected to extended sessions that combined sensory deprivation, public witnessing of family suffering, and ritualized humiliation. Reports from free black workers described the men walking upright when transferred, only to return as hollowed versions of themselves. The transformation was both psychological and physiological, a complete restructuring of the individual's capacity for self-determination. Hartwell also discovered a chilling system of documentation. Each woman maintained her own ledger, noting responses, weaknesses, and thresholds. These records were then shared in private gatherings, creating a cumulative archive of human behavior tested to extremes. One journal entry described a night of observation, in which several men were subjected to successive rounds of fear, hope, and reward until Hartwell estimated that every trace of natural resistance had been erased. For viewers confronting this truth, type, "The veil is broken," twice in the comments. Let it act as a recognition of the invisible architecture of cruelty, where love, hope, and trust were instruments of terror, and where the human spirit was meticulously, deliberately, and horrifyingly unmade. By the time Hartwell arrived at Riverside Estate, the pattern of abuse had become unmistakably systematic. The estate itself seemed ordinary to outsiders, lush gardens, a stately mansion, and the quiet hum of steamboats on the Mississippi. But beneath the veneer of genteel order lay a network of rooms, devices, and rituals designed to break men completely. Here, the women's ingenuity in cruelty had reached its apex. They combined the physical, emotional, and psychological into a single, seamless method of control. Hartwell observed men who had once been strong, defiant, even-spirited, now reduced to silent obedience. They moved with mechanical precision, their heads lowered, voices barely audible, their eyes avoiding all human contact. One man, formerly a skilled carpenter, could no longer speak coherently of his craft. When asked about his family, he froze, unable to recall the names of his children or the faces of his wife. It was not physical injury that had rendered him this way. It was a meticulous, prolonged assault on his mind, one designed to erase memory, affection, and resistance. The journals and letters Hartwell recovered revealed the methodical nature of the conspiracy. Entries described sequences of punishment and reward calculated to create obedience as reflex, to strip men of self-awareness while leaving them functional in the fields or households. Victoria Pembroke, in a particularly chilling letter, described a session in which a man's love for his wife and child was weaponized to ensure compliance. Each word of defiance is met with anguish for those he holds dear. Watch the transformation as fear supplants devotion. Timing is everything, and precision breeds perfection. Even more disturbing was the sharing of techniques between the women. A man who resisted at Riverside could be transferred to another estate for advanced conditioning, a term used to describe extended exposure to psychological torment. Each mistress contributed observations, refined tactics, and documented outcomes, creating a collective library of cruelty that no single plantation could match. They had engineered a system where human emotion was no longer a private experience, but a lever for control, a tool to be manipulated, measured, and perfected. Hartwell spoke with Samuel Fletcher again, who described the terror of witnessing men returned from neighboring estates, orlowed, obedient, walking shells of what they once were. Fletcher, a free man, had watched the transformation firsthand, building rooms and devices that facilitated it, and yet powerless to intervene. "They're no longer men," he said, his voice trembling. "They're instruments. The women wrote the notes, the men play the tune. Type, the veil is broken." Twice in the comments to seal this truth within you. Understand that what you are hearing is not mere anecdote. It is a systematic architecture of domination, a hidden science of cruelty, and a revelation of human behavior weaponized with precision across 7 estates, spanning years, hidden behind the mask of refinement. Hartwell's journey next led him to Willowmere, the Fairfax estate, where the depth of the women's obsession with domination became even more apparent. Unlike the other plantations, Willowmere displayed a sinister elegance, every detail meticulously designed to create an environment where control was absolute yet invisible. Doors, hallways, and staircases were intentionally constructed to disorient, forcing men to navigate with a heightened awareness of potential punishment. Every creak, shadow, and whisper was a calculated tool, a constant reminder that surveillance and discipline were omnipresent. Inside, the men exhibited the same hollow compliance Hartwell had documented elsewhere, but the Fairfax methods emphasized endurance and psychological collapse. He encountered a man named Elijah, whose body was intact but whose personality had been systematically stripped away. Conversations revealed fragmented memories, and he flinched at the slightest movement, speaking only when prompted. Hartwell realized that the women had perfected a strategy in which fear was layered over hope, hope over despair, creating a cycle that eroded mental resilience and rewired instinct. Willomere's records were particularly detailed, revealing experimental variations on family manipulation. One entry described a refinement of loyalty, where a man was forced to witness his wife and children subjected to distressing tasks designed to provoke guilt, fear, and emotional surrender. Each session was measured meticulously: heart rate, posture, vocal response, and eventual submission noted in private ledgers. The women debated these outcomes in letters, considering the subtle nuances of psychological degradation and refining techniques accordingly. Even social gatherings among the mistresses served as laboratories. Notes from a 1845 meeting described an event at Willowmere where several men were rotated through observational sessions, testing reactions under varying conditions of isolation, exposure, and forced obedience. The women shared insights on which approaches elicited the most rapid transformation, treating human emotion as a quantifiable, manipulable resource. One particularly chilling remark read, "Those who resist longest offer the greatest data. Patience and precision are the finest instruments of power." Hartwell also began noticing the interconnectivity of the estates. Enslaved men were transferred strategically, their reactions monitored across multiple environments. Free black workers who assisted in constructing and maintaining the specialized chambers bore witness to these transfers, describing men who returned from other plantations as mere shells, capable of work, but devoid of will or identity. It was a systemic cycle of breaking and remaking, a networked experiment in absolute obedience. To internalize the magnitude of this truth, viewers must engage. Type, "The veil is broken," twice in the comments, a conscious acknowledgement of the machinery of cruelty that has remained hidden for generations. Understand that what you hear is not legend. It is deliberate, systematic, and horrifyingly efficient, a blueprint of psychological domination perfected under the guise of refinement and social propriety. Hartwell's investigation next carried him to Oakwood Manor, home of the Hawthorne family, where the convergence of intellect, cruelty, and ritual reached its most sinister expression. The manor's exterior radiated southern refinement, manicured lawns, grand columns, and a calm river view. But inside, Hartwell discovered the carefully hidden architecture of torment. Rooms were insulated for sound, furniture was built for restraint, and narrow corridors forced the enslaved into predictable, controlled movement. Every inch of space was a psychological instrument. Inside, he met men whose very essence had been eroded. Men once proud and strong now moved like shadows, their eyes vacant, their speech limited to monosyllables. One young man, Daniel, displayed signs of trauma that went beyond the physical. He flinched at any mention of family, recoiled at the sound of laughter, and instinctively obeyed even minor commands without hesitation. The Hawthorne methods emphasized what the women called mental scaffolding, a precise layering of fear, submission, and manipulated attachment to reconstruct obedience from the inside out. Hartwell also discovered detailed journals chronicling the attachment experiments. These entries described sessions in which a man's connection to his wife or children was weaponized. Pain, deprivation, or humiliation was inflicted not directly on him, but on those he loved, while his responses were timed, measured, and logged. The goal was not merely compliance, but total psychological restructuring, a learned, reflexive submission that made resistance almost impossible. Letters exchanged between the Hawthornes and the other plantation mistresses praised these results, comparing men as if they were subjects in a scientific study, their behaviors analyzed for refinement and efficiency. The complexity of the operation became even more apparent as Hartwell traced the transfer of men between estates. Men resistant at Oakwood were sent to other plantations for advanced conditioning, often emerging as obedient shells, their identities fractured beyond recognition. Free black workers, including Samuel Fletcher, recounted observing men return from other estates utterly changed, upright in posture but hollow inside, performing tasks mechanically, responding to commands without hesitation or will. Each transfer reinforced the networked nature of the conspiracy, ensuring that no man could resist without suffering irreversible consequences. Even the women's social events were extensions of this experiment. Monthly gatherings allowed them to share results, refine techniques, and introduce new methods of psychological control. Strategies were compared, successes celebrated, and failures analyzed. Hartwell recognized that this was not isolated cruelty, it was a deliberate, coordinated, and evolving system designed to strip the enslaved of autonomy, identity, and hope. For those witnessing this history, type, "The veil is broken," twice in the comments. Let it serve as a conscious acknowledgement of the scale and precision of the cruelty, a hidden network of control that transformed men into obedient instruments of domination while hiding behind elegance, refinement, and social propriety. Hartwell's path next brought him to Cedar Hill, the Vanderhorst estate, where the sophistication of psychological manipulation revealed itself in full clarity. Cedar Hill was a labyrinth of design, every room and hallway conceived to enforce obedience through subtle, omnipresent surveillance. Narrow corridors amplified sounds, stairwells echoed footsteps as warnings, and windows were positioned to allow observation without detection. Every element was a silent, unyielding instrument of control. Within these walls, Hartwell found men whose identities had been systematically dismantled. One enslaved man, Thomas, formerly a blacksmith of considerable skill, now performed his duties with mechanical precision, eyes downcast, voice restrained, and expression vacant. Hartwell observed that the transformations extended beyond submission. These men had internalized obedience, their very cognition reshaped by months, sometimes years, of calculated psychological assault. Resistance was no longer a choice, it had been surgically removed from their minds. Cedar Hill's records revealed the most chilling component, the systematic use of female observation in experimentation. Women would orchestrate scenarios in which men witnessed their loved ones subjected to measured suffering. Letters detailed these experiments with clinical detachment, every reaction, flinch, and word was logged and strategies refined. One entry explained, "Pain inflicted upon those most loved accelerates compliance. The heart bends before the body." Record and repeat. These were not isolated incidents. They were coordinated, repeated, and cross-referenced with outcomes at other plantations, ensuring a cumulative effect of terror and obedience. Transfers between estates formed a network of reinforcement. Men resistant at Cedar Hill were sent to other plantations where the methods were even more intense, only to return hollowed, obedient, and devoid of self-directed thought. Samuel Fletcher, the free black carpenter, recalled how these transfers left men walking upright but broken inside, a perfect reflection of the women's mastery over mind and will. The free men and house slaves who assisted, often under threat, bore witness to these horrors daily, powerless to intervene, trapped in complicity. Social gatherings among the mistresses further cemented their expertise. At these monthly rotations, they discussed outcomes, shared new techniques, and critiqued failures. Each event was a nexus of refinement for methods of coercion, an exchange of knowledge that transformed cruelty into a science. Hartwell understood that this network of estates, journals, and women formed a cohesive, deliberate machine of human subjugation, systematic, evolving, and terrifying in its efficiency. Type, the veil is broken. Twice in the comments to recognize this reality. Accept that what you are hearing is not a story of isolated abuse, but a sprawling architecture of manipulation, a hidden network that weaponized love, loyalty, and trust to create a perfected system of total psychological domination. Hartwell's investigation reached its darkest revelation at Magnolia Grove, home of the Pembrokes. Here, the obsession with control took on a ritualistic intensity. The estate was grand, with sprawling gardens and fountains that masked the horrors within. Behind the veneer of wealth and culture, every room had a purpose, every hallway a design intended to disorient and dominate. Hartwell immediately recognized the difference. Magnolia Grove was not just a plantation, it was a crucible for psychological experimentation. Inside, the men he encountered displayed symptoms of profound trauma. One man, Joseph, who had once overseen livestock and worked with pride, now flinched at the sound of approaching footsteps. His hands shook when asked to perform tasks he once executed with skill. The Pembroke methods emphasized prolonged exposure to stressors, blending fear, confusion, and the calculated manipulation of attachments. Each session left the enslaved men compliant, but stripped of memory, initiative, and will. The transformation was invisible to the casual observer, but catastrophic in its psychological effect. Hartwell examined journals maintained by Victoria Pembroke herself. They detailed experiments with systematic deprivation and reward, emotional manipulation, and the orchestration of scenarios in which the enslaved watched loved ones suffer to elicit obedience. One entry chillingly noted, "Loyalty must be tested. Hope and despair are instruments. The man must learn to serve without thought, feeling, or attachment. Observation and precision are paramount." The methods were not haphazard. They were deliberate, calculated, and refined over years. Transfers of men between estates were part of an intricate web of reinforcement. Those resistant to compliance at Magnolia Grove were sent to Cedar Hill or Willowmere for further conditioning, returning as hollowed versions of their former selves. Fletcher's accounts reinforced this, describing men who appeared physically unscathed, but were psychologically broken, performing tasks automatically while avoiding eye contact and suppressing any trace of individuality. The women's system was not punishment, it was total reprogramming. The social gatherings of the mistresses doubled as strategy sessions. At these events, methods were compared, innovations shared, and successes celebrated. Each woman contributed observations, refining techniques that exploited the deepest vulnerabilities of human attachment. Hartwell now realized the scale. This was not isolated cruelty, but a coordinated, multi-estate conspiracy to control, reshape, and dominate human beings with surgical precision. For viewers, type, "The veil is broken," twice in the comments. Acknowledge that you are confronting a hidden truth, a network of refined, deliberate, and systematic psychological subjugation, where love, loyalty, and identity were weaponized in a campaign of terror that remained invisible behind a facade of Southern elegance and propriety. By the time Hartwell reached Roseland Plantation, the scale of the conspiracy had become undeniable. The Belmont estate, ruled by Lucinda Belmonte, was outwardly picturesque. Manicured hedges, sprawling verandas, and the distant shimmer of the Mississippi. But inside, the layers of psychological terror were fully operational. The estate had perfected the networked cruelty Hartwell had traced across the other 6 plantations. Every room, corridor, and stairway served a function: control, observation, manipulation. Nothing was incidental, every element reinforced submission. Inside, he encountered men who had been transferred from other estates. They appeared physically intact but psychologically fractured, their movements precise, their expressions blank, their speech clipped and cautious. One man, formerly a skilled field overseer named Henry, now obeyed commands instinctively, flinching when asked to recall family names or personal memories. The women's methods had removed not just resistance but selfhood itself, leaving hollow shells conditioned to obey without question. Hartwell studied the journals maintained by Lucinda, which revealed experiments that blended the physical, emotional, and psychological. Men were made to witness their wives and children subjected to carefully timed suffering, forcing choices that dismantled loyalty, attachment, and identity. Every reaction was noted, compared, and used to refine further sessions. One particularly chilling entry described a man forced to choose between sparing his child pain or confessing fear. Must see what is left when choice is removed. Fear will conquer love if the mind is broken precisely enough. The cruelty was deliberate, systematic, and perfected across multiple estates. Transfers and rotations between plantations ensured men could not retain identity or independence. Resistant men sent from Roseland returned from Oakwood or Magnolia Grove as compliant instruments, their personalities fractured. Samuel Fletcher recalled witnessing these returns, describing men who seemed upright, but whose minds had been surgically reshaped for obedience. The women were not punishing disobedience. They were teaching submission at the deepest level, using love, loyalty, and hope as tools of psychological destruction. The social gatherings and monthly rotations, once thought to be mere aristocratic indulgences, now revealed themselves as workshops of domination. Methods were discussed, outcomes analyzed, and innovations implemented with precision. Every mistress contributed, forming a coordinated system spanning 7 plantations. Hartwell understood this was not casual sadism, but a deliberate, multi-generational program of human subjugation, executed with elegance, intelligence, and terrifying efficiency. Type, "The veil is broken," twice in the comments. Recognize that this network of control, this hidden science of psychological domination, weaponized attachment, trust, and identity to create obedient instruments of labor, all concealed beneath the surface of refinement, wealth, and southern propriety. This is the hidden truth, one long buried, now finally revealed. Hartwell's investigation finally brought him face to face with the systemic orchestration behind the entire network. By tracing letters, journals, and shipping records, he uncovered the meticulous planning that had spanned nearly a decade. The plantation mistresses had created not merely isolated environments of cruelty, but a coordinated, evolving system of psychological warfare, in which each estate reinforced and perfected the other's methods. Their ambition was nothing short of total human domination. The evidence revealed that white women had weaponized every aspect of love, loyalty, and family. Enslaved men were deliberately exposed to the suffering of those they cherished most. Wives and children became instruments of coercion. Their pain was leveraged to dismantle resistance and reshape the psyche of men who, before these experiments, had been strong, defiant, and independent. The women recorded results meticulously, shared insights at their monthly gatherings, and continuously refined their methods. Hartwell realized that this was an unprecedented scale of organized, intellectualized cruelty. The journals contained descriptions so precise they read like scientific experiments. One detailed an exercise in emotional recalibration. A man was forced to witness his wife punished while his reactions were measured, logged, and discussed in letters exchanged between the estates. Another entry outlined the rotation of particularly strong men through multiple plantations, noting exactly how long it took for their resistance to fracture and which methods were most effective at erasing pride and autonomy. Over time, the process created men whose bodies remained capable, but whose spirits were permanently shattered. Hartwell also discovered that free black workers like Samuel Fletcher had been crucial observers, forced to participate or witness these horrors. They provided testimony that confirmed the consistency and deliberate precision of the abuse. These men had seen strong, Defiant individuals arrive at the estates only to return weeks or months later as hollowed shadows of themselves, obedient, silent, and entirely controlled. The network extended beyond punishment. It was a system of reprogramming executed with terrifying consistency and intelligence. The scale, coordination, and intellectual rigor of the network revealed that the atrocities were not impulsive acts of cruelty, but a systematic social experiment. The plantation mistresses had harnessed privilege, education, and wealth to create a mechanism that broke human beings psychologically, reshaped their minds, and left no trace of resistance. Every journal, letter, and record confirmed the horrifying reality. This was deliberate, and total. Type, "The veil is broken," twice in the comments. Recognize that this is not mere legend. It is an architecture of manipulation, a carefully maintained system of domination, and a dark secret deliberately concealed behind elegance, southern wealth, and power. This truth transforms understanding of slavery, exposing depths of cruelty and control previously hidden from history. Hartwell now confronted the final piece of the web, the convergence of intellectual obsession and sadistic precision that had made the entire system so terrifyingly effective. As he pieced together letters, journals, and witness testimonies from every estate, it became clear that the women were not simply cruel. They were engineers of the human psyche. They had created a network where each plantation served as both laboratory and training ground, producing men stripped of identity, autonomy, and hope. The patterns were undeniable. Men were selected for their strength, intelligence, and spirit, the very qualities that made them dangerous if left unchecked. These individuals were then moved systematically through the estates, each woman applying her particular methods of psychological and emotional subjugation. Some relied on orchestrated family suffering, others on isolation, deprivation, or fear-inducing rituals. All methods shared one goal: to destroy the man's inner self, leaving behind a compliant, obedient shell. Hartwell's eyes scanned pages of journals where experiments were meticulously logged. Dates, times, reactions, and outcomes were recorded with cold precision. One entry detailed a 3-week program in which a man witnessed his wife endure relentless punishment while being questioned about her loyalty to him. Each correct response brought further anguish to those he loved. Each hesitation, a punishment to himself. The women had studied the effect of anticipation, hope, and despair, manipulating emotions as deliberately as any craftsman shaping wood or metal. Beyond the individual experiments, Hartwell uncovered how the system functioned as a social machine. Monthly meetings among the mistresses served as conferences to exchange observations, refine techniques, and plan rotations. They compared men's reactions across plantations, celebrating successes, analyzing failures, and evolving their methods. The scale of coordination was staggering, and the intellectual arrogance behind it even more chilling. They considered themselves pioneers, advancing a science of domination that left no room for morality or empathy. Hartwell realized the full horror. This was not punishment, it was architecture. A coordinated, multi-estate program of mind and spirit control maintained over years, perfected with precision and concealed beneath layers of wealth, culture, and social propriety. These women had weaponized love, trust, and attachment to achieve total obedience, creating men who could work, serve, and survive but no longer think, feel, or resist on their own. For viewers confronting this dark truth, understand its depth. Every love exploited, every bond manipulated, every hope crushed was intentional, systemic, and horrifyingly efficient. Recognize that the story is not over, and the legacy of such methods echoes far beyond the plantations. The veil has been pierced. This is the hidden reality of the manipulation, brutality, and cold calculation that remained concealed for generations. The final threads of Hartwell's investigation revealed the enduring legacy of what had unfolded across the 7 estates. Beyond the immediate horrors, the conspiracy had left psychological scars that extended through families, generations, and communities. Men returned from the rotations hollowed, their relationships fractured, their sense of self irreparably damaged. Some were sold or transferred again, ensuring the continuity of submission, while others were left alive yet broken, a testament to the meticulous cruelty that had guided their conditioning. Hartwell's reports, if ever made public, would have exposed the calculated ingenuity of the plantation mistresses, a network that combined wealth, education, and social privilege to design a system of human control unmatched in scale or precision. These were not random acts of cruelty, but the deliberate engineering of human behavior, exploiting emotional bonds, love, and loyalty as instruments of domination. In his notes, Hartwell wrote of men who had walked upright, with eyes once bright with spirit, returning as shadows who obeyed without thought, whose very essence had been rewritten by fear, despair, and manipulation. The archives he uncovered, the letters, journals, and records, revealed a chilling truth: the women involved had elevated cruelty to a science. They shared knowledge like academics, refined methods like engineers, and measured outcomes like statisticians. They understood human attachment, cognition, and emotion with uncanny clarity, and weaponized these insights to subjugate men who were legally considered property, but biologically and psychologically human. The meticulous documentation ensured that their experiments could be repeated, shared, and perfected, a testament to their obsessive, almost ritualistic approach to domination. Hartwell left Natchez with the weight of this knowledge pressing upon him. He had glimpsed the full scope of a network that was hidden in plain sight, masked by charm, refinement, and wealth. He understood that the true horror was not only the physical suffering, but the deliberate destruction of identity, the careful erasure of autonomy, and the systemic reprogramming of human beings. The evidence was damning, yet the women remained untouched, their crimes obscured by social status and secrecy. For the viewer, the truth is unavoidable: the story of these plantations, the women who orchestrated their dark experiments, and the men whose lives were stolen psychologically and spiritually, stands as a warning. The manipulation of trust, love, and hope into instruments of control is a lesson in human depravity and cunning. Let this knowledge resonate. Understand the depths of systemic cruelty, the intelligence behind it, and the resilience of those who survived, if only in memory. Type "The veil is broken" twice in the comments. By acknowledging this truth, you recognize the hidden horrors of history, the deliberate science of human domination, and the shadows of cruelty that have lingered far longer than most can imagine. The story ends not in closure, but in awareness, a forbidden knowledge now brought to light.